A bullied teen stood up for a kid, not realizing he'd grow up to be a famous athlete who remembered. The moment lasted seconds. A flash of courage in 17-year-old Mason Wright's otherwise cautious existence, but it would ripple across years and lives in ways he couldn't possibly imagine that autumn afternoon. Mason hunched his shoulders against the chill October wind as he walked home from another day of quiet survival at Westfield High. His worn backpack hung heavy with textbooks and the weight of invisibility, that peculiar burden of being simultaneously forgettable to most and an irresistible target to some. Today had been better than most. He'd made it through lunch without Tyler Braddock and his friends noticing him, and Mrs. Simmons had nodded approvingly at his English essay. Small victories. That's what Mason's life had become. A collection of moments when things didn't go wrong. He cut through Riverside Park, fallen leaves crunching beneath his sneakers. The shortcut would save him 10 minutes. 10 fewer minutes of being exposed and vulnerable in public. The park was usually empty this time of day, which was precisely why Mason preferred it. But not today. The sounds reached him before the scene came into view. Jeering voices, laughter with that unmistakable cruel edge, and underneath it all, the stifled sounds of someone trying not to cry. Mason slowed his steps. Every instinct told him to turn around, find another route. Don't get involved. Stay invisible. He rounded the bend in the path and saw them. 3 boys surrounding a much smaller kid near the old oak tree. Mason recognized the tallest of the 3 as Jake Mercer, a freshman who seemed determined to build his reputation as quickly as possible. The kid they were circling couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, skinny with curly dark hair, his school backpack lying open on the ground, contents scattered across the dirt. "Just leave me alone," the younger boy said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Or what?" Jake stepped closer, using his height to loom over the kid. "What exactly are you going to do about it, Martinez?" Mason's feet had stopped moving. This was not his problem. He'd spent 3 years learning how to navigate the treacherous waters of high school by becoming as unnoticeable as possible. He'd perfected the art of slipping through hallways undetected, of finding empty bathroom stalls during lunch, of never making eye contact with the boys who had decided, for reasons Mason still couldn't understand, that he deserved to be their primary entertainment. The smaller boy, Martinez, straightened his shoulders, though it did little to make him appear any larger. "I'm going to be late for practice. Coach will wonder where I am." Jake snorted. "Coach Reynolds? You think he cares about some 6th grade nobody? You're nothing special, Martinez. Just because you scored a few goals doesn't mean..." "Hey!" The word left Mason's mouth before his brain had fully authorized it. 4 heads turned in his direction. For one terrible moment, Mason considered running. His heart hammered so hard he felt it might crack his ribs, but his feet remained rooted to the path, leaves swirling around his ankles in the autumn breeze. "Mind your own business," Jake called, his attention momentarily diverted from the younger boy. Mason took a step forward, then another. Each movement felt like pushing through concrete. What was he doing? This wasn't him. He didn't confront people. He didn't draw attention to himself. But something about the scene before him, something about the determined set of the younger boy's jaw, even as his eyes betrayed his fear, struck a chord so deep within Mason that he couldn't walk away. "Leave him alone," Mason said, his voice steadier than he felt. He stopped a few feet away from the group, close enough to be unmistakably involved, but far enough to have a chance at running if things went badly. Jake looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't quite process that someone was interrupting his fun. "Do I know you?" "No," Mason said. "And you don't need to. Just leave the kid alone." One of Jake's friends snickered. "What are you, his bodyguard?" Mason ignored him, keeping his eyes on Jake, who seemed to be the leader of this small pack. The younger boy, Martinez, was watching Mason with an expression of cautious hope mingled with confusion. "I'm not looking for trouble," Mason continued, amazed at how calm he sounded when his insides were twisted with fear. "But he clearly wants to be left alone. So just move on." Jake took a step toward Mason, sizing him up. Mason was tall but thin, with none of the bulk that would make him intimidating. But he had height at least, which put him a few inches above Jake. "You're that weird, quiet kid from the senior class, aren't you?" Jake said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The one Tyler and those guys mess with sometimes." Mason flinched inwardly but kept his expression neutral. "I'm just someone who thinks 3 against 1 isn't very fair. Especially when he's half your size." A tense silence followed. Mason could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck despite the cool autumn air. He was acutely aware that he had no plan beyond these few sentences. If Jake decided to redirect his aggression, Mason had nothing. No fighting skills, no backup, no clever exit strategy. Just then, the distant sound of a whistle cut through the air. "That's Coach," Martinez said quickly. "He's looking for me." Jake hesitated, glancing in the direction of the sports fields just visible through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, he shrugged with elaborate casualness. "Whatever. We were done here anyway." He turned to Martinez. "This isn't over, though." Mason stood perfectly still as Jake and his friends sauntered away, only releasing his breath when they disappeared around the bend in the path. His legs felt suddenly weak, adrenaline leaving his system in a rush that made him slightly dizzy. The younger boy was already gathering his scattered belongings, shoving papers and books back into his backpack with hurried movements. "Thanks," he said without looking up. "You didn't have to do that." "It's okay," Mason replied, bending down to help collect a few papers that had blown farther away. "Are you all right?" The boy nodded, finally looking up as Mason handed him the rescued papers. His dark eyes were intense, studying Mason's face with surprising directness for someone so young. "I'm Diego," he said. "Diego Martinez." "Mason Wright." Diego zipped his backpack and stood, still looking at Mason with that unnervingly direct gaze. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the question, because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. It wasn't right what they were doing, but they could have gone after you instead. "Yeah," Mason said, surprised by the kid's perceptiveness. "I guess they could have." Diego seemed about to say something else when the whistle sounded again, closer this time. "I gotta go," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Coach hates when anyone's late." He hesitated for a moment. "Those guys, the ones who were bothering me, they said something about people messing with you too." Mason's face warmed with embarrassment. "It's nothing, just high school stuff." Diego nodded slowly, seeming to understand more than Mason had said. "Well, thanks again. Maybe I'll see you around." Then he was gone, sprinting through the trees toward the sports fields, leaving Mason alone with the rustling leaves and the fading rush of adrenaline in his veins. As Mason continued his walk home, he wondered if he'd done something incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Either way, it was the most remarkable thing that had happened to him in years. He had no way of knowing that the brief encounter would be the first thread in a tapestry of connections that would shape the rest of his life. The next few weeks passed without incident. Mason saw Diego once or twice in the park, both times from a distance. The younger boy had waved, and Mason had waved back, but their paths hadn't directly crossed again. Jake Mercer and his friends seemed to have found other entertainment, and Mason's life returned to its careful rhythm of intentional invisibility. Until the day Tyler Braddock was waiting for him after school, Mason saw him too late. Tyler leaning against the brick wall near the side exit Mason always used, two of his usual companions flanking him. Mason froze mid-step, his mind racing through alternatives. The main entrance would be crowded with teachers still. He could go back inside and... "Right!" Tyler called, pushing himself off the wall with a lazy smile that never reached his eyes. "Just the man I was looking for." Mason's mouth went dry. 3 years of navigating Westfield High had taught him that nothing good ever followed that particular smile. "I've got to get home," Mason said, already knowing it was useless. Tyler sauntered closer, his friends following like well-trained dogs. "Heard you've been playing hero lately, rescuing little kids in the park." The cold dread that washed over Mason had nothing to do with the November chill in the air. Jake must have mentioned the incident to Tyler. Of course he would. The social hierarchy of bullies was its own intricate ecosystem, and Mason had disrupted it. "It wasn't like that," Mason said, even as he wondered why he was bothering to explain. "I was just passing by." "See, that's what confuses me, right?" Tyler was close enough now that Mason could smell the mint gum he was chewing. "You spend years keeping your head down, staying out of everyone's way, and suddenly you're Captain America? Doesn't make sense." One of Tyler's friends snickered. Mason's eyes darted around, looking for a teacher, a parent picking up a student, anyone who might interrupt what was clearly coming. But the side parking lot was emptying quickly, most students already gone for the day. "I didn't mean to," Mason began, but Tyler cut him off. "Here's the thing," he said, his voice deceptively conversational. "When you step into someone else's business, you're making it your business. Jake's a freshman, still learning the ropes. But that Martinez kid? He's mine." Mason blinked, confusion momentarily overriding his fear. "Yours?" What does that even mean? He's just a middle schooler. Tyler's eyes narrowed. It means my little brother's in his class, and that Martinez kid embarrassed him at some sports thing. So Jake was doing me a favor, putting him in his place. And you got in the way. The absurdity of it all, this elaborate chain of perceived slights and delegated retribution, might have made Mason laugh if the situation weren't so precarious. Look, Mason said, trying to keep his voice steady, I didn't know any of that. I just saw 3 guys picking on someone half their size and reacted. It wasn't personal. Well, now it is personal, Tyler replied, taking another step closer. Mason braced himself, muscles tensing. He wasn't a fighter, had never been in a real fight in his life. But some primal instinct was preparing his body anyway, flooding his system with adrenaline that had nowhere productive to go. What happened next would later blur in Mason's memory, condensed into fragments of sound and sensation. The scrape of shoes on asphalt, the thud of his back hitting the brick wall, the sharp pain when knuckles connected with his ribs, the metallic taste of blood from his bitten tongue. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. Tyler seemed more interested in establishing dominance than causing serious harm. A warning, not a punishment. Still, by the time they left him there against the wall, Mason's right eye was swelling, his ribs ached with each breath, and his dignity lay somewhere on the pavement alongside his scattered school books. He sat there for several minutes, waiting for the shaking in his hands to subside, breathing through the initial waves of pain. The parking lot was empty now, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Slowly, wincing with each movement, Mason gathered his books and stood. The walk home had never felt longer. His mother wouldn't be back from her shift at the hospital until late, which was a small mercy. Mason had time to ice his face, to construct a plausible story about tripping during PE, to compose himself before having to explain anything. As he limped through the park, unwilling to take the longer route around despite what had happened, Mason found himself at the spot where he'd encountered Diego and Jake. The memory felt distant now, as if it had happened to someone else, someone braver and more foolish than he could afford to be. Stupid, he muttered to himself, wincing as he shifted his backpack to his other shoulder. So stupid. But even as the words left his mouth, even as he catalyzed his new bruises, Mason couldn't quite convince himself that he regretted what he'd done. The image of Diego Martinez's face, the relief and gratitude in those dark, serious eyes, kept resurfacing through the haze of pain and self-recrimination. If he had it to do over again, knowing what would come after, would he still have stopped? Would he still have spoken up? Mason didn't have an answer as he trudged home through the fallen leaves, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and gold. Diego Martinez was having the best soccer practice of his life. Every pass connected, every shot found its mark. Every sprint left him exhilarated rather than exhausted. Even Coach Reynolds, normally sparing with praise, had nodded approvingly when Diego executed a perfect through ball to his teammate. Looking sharp today, Martinez, the coach called. Keep that up and varsity will be scouting you before you hit high school. Diego grinned, the praise warming him more effectively than the weak November sunshine. He'd been playing with unusual intensity all week, channeling his frustration and anger into the game he loved. Every time he remembered Jake Mercer's sneering face or the humiliation of having his backpack dumped onto the ground, Diego pushed himself harder, ran faster, kicked stronger. And when that didn't fully dispel the knot of anger in his chest, he thought about the tall, quiet high school kid who had appeared like some unlikely guardian angel. The one who'd faced down 3 bigger boys without any visible fear, though Diego had noticed the slight tremor in his hands. Mason Wright, Diego had asked around about him, curious about this stranger who'd intervened on his behalf. The answers were vague and unimpressive. A senior at the high school. Quiet guy, keeps to himself. Not particularly good at sports or academics or anything noteworthy. Just there. But Diego couldn't reconcile those bland descriptions with what he'd witnessed. There had been something in Mason's eyes when he'd stepped forward. Not confidence exactly, but determination. A decision made and committed to despite fear. Diego had been thinking about that moment a lot lately. After practice, as he was helping collect the training cones, Coach Reynolds approached him. "Your footwork's improved," the coach said, clipboard tucked under one arm. "You've been practicing those drills I showed you?" "Yes, sir," Diego nodded. "Every day." It wasn't entirely true. He practiced most days, but sometimes schoolwork or family responsibilities got in the way. Still, the coach's approving nod made the small lie worth it. Good. You've got real potential, Martinez. Raw talent, but talent only gets you so far. I know, coach. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. Diego recited the mantra coach had drilled into them since the first day of practice. Exactly. Reynolds paused, studying Diego with unexpected seriousness. Everything okay with you otherwise? You seem, I don't know, more intense lately. Diego hesitated. Coach Reynolds wasn't exactly the warm, confiding type. He was fair but distant, focused on developing their athletic abilities rather than their emotional well-being. I'm fine, Diego said automatically. Just focused on improving. Reynolds nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. Well, keep it up. The showcase tournament is in 3 weeks, and there'll be scouts from the Regional Development Academy there. They start young these days, looking for talent to nurture. Could be a big opportunity. After Coach walked away, Diego finished gathering equipment with his teammates, his mind buzzing with excitement. The Regional Development Academy was the first step toward serious soccer, the kind that could eventually lead to college scholarships, maybe even professional opportunities someday. Coach had never mentioned Diego specifically in connection with the academy before. As he walked home later, soccer bag slung over his shoulder, Diego's buoyant mood carried him all the way to his street before reality intruded. The familiar sight of his apartment building, shabby but clean, the brick facade crumbling slightly at the corners, brought his dreams back to earth. The regional academy cost money, not professional sports money, but more than his family could easily spare. His mother worked 2 jobs already, and his father's construction work was seasonal, less reliable in the winter months ahead. They supported his soccer enthusiastically, but the conversation about the academy fees would be difficult. Diego climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, using his key to let himself in. The small living room was empty, but he could hear his mother in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of dinner preparation, the rhythmic chopping of a knife, the sizzle of oil in a pan, the radio playing softly in the background. "Mama, I'm home," he called, dropping his soccer bag by the door and kicking off his shoes. Elena Martinez appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, her face lighting up at the sight of her son. Despite working night shifts at the hospital as a custodian, she somehow always managed to be home when Diego returned from practice, making sure he had a proper meal before she left for work. "How was practice, mijo?" she asked, returning to the stove where onions and peppers were cooking. "Really good," Diego said, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Coach said I'm improving." He mentioned the regional academy scouts will be at the showcase tournament. His mother's hands paused briefly in their work, then resumed chopping. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice warm with pride. "Your hard work is paying off." Diego hesitated, then plunged ahead. "If they're interested, we'd need to talk about the fees. It's not cheap." Elena turned to look at him, her expression softening. "Let's not worry about that yet, Diego. First, let's see if they're interested. Then your father and I will find a way." "We always do." The simple confidence in her voice, "we'll find a way," made Diego's throat tighten unexpectedly. His parents never made him feel like a burden, even when he knew money was tight, even when he overheard their late-night conversations about bills and hours and making ends meet. "Thanks, Mama," he said quietly. She smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair the way she'd done since he was small. "Now go wash up properly. Dinner in 15 minutes and your homework after." Later that night, after his mother had left for her shift and his father had returned home tired from a day at the construction site, Diego sat at the small desk in his bedroom, trying to focus on his math assignment. But his thoughts kept drifting between the excitement of Coach's praise and the lingering unease from the incident in the park. He hadn't told his parents about Jake Mercer and his friends. They had enough to worry about without adding schoolyard bullies to the list. Besides, it hadn't been that big a deal, really. Nothing had actually happened, thanks to Mason Wright. Diego wondered how Mason was doing. Had there been consequences for him stepping in like that? Jake had seemed the type to hold grudges, and Mason had mentioned something about high school stuff. Problems of his own that Diego's situation had probably complicated. With a sigh, Diego turned back to his math homework. "One problem at a time," his father always said. "Focus on what's in front of you." But as he worked through equations, a part of his mind remained fixed on the tall, quiet boy who had chosen to stop and help when he could just as easily have walked away. Mason stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, carefully prodding the area around his eye. The swelling had gone down significantly over the weekend, and the discoloration had faded to a yellowish green that was less immediately noticeable. His ribs still ached when he breathed deeply, but the sharp pain had subsided to a dull throb. Monday morning loomed with its usual dread, amplified by the knowledge that Tyler and his friends would be there, watching for any sign that they'd gotten to him. Mason had spent the weekend alternating between icing his injuries and mentally rehearsing how he would act at school. Casual, unaffected, as if the encounter had been so insignificant he'd barely registered it. His mother had accepted the story about tripping during PE with skepticism, but hadn't pressed the issue. Single parenting while working full-time as a nurse left her with limited energy for interrogations, especially when Mason insisted he was fine. Besides, it wasn't the first time he'd come home with unexplained bruises, though it had been a while. Ready for school? Sarah Wright appeared in the bathroom doorway, already dressed in her hospital scrubs, travel mug of coffee in hand. Her eyes lingered on the fading bruise around his eye. As I'll ever be, Mason replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His mother studied him for a moment longer, concern etched in the fine lines around her eyes. At 39, Sarah Wright still retained the warm beauty that shone from old photographs, though years of night shifts and worry had added a weariness that hadn't been there before his father left. Mason, she began, then paused, seeming to reconsider her words. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything? I know, Mom. Mason turned away from the mirror, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But there's nothing to talk about. I'm fine. Sarah sighed, a soft sound of resignation that made guilt twist in Mason's stomach. He hated making her worry, hated adding to the burdens she already carried. All right, she said finally. I'm working a double shift today, so I won't be home until tomorrow morning. There's lasagna in the fridge you can heat up. Got it. Thanks. She hesitated a moment longer, then stepped forward to press a quick kiss to his forehead, the way she used to when he was small. Have a good day, sweetheart. I love you. Love you too, Mom. After she left, Mason finished getting ready with methodical slowness, delaying the inevitable as long as possible. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence pressing against his ears as he gathered his school books and shoved them into his backpack. The walk to school was cold, the late November air carrying the first hints of winter. Mason pulled his jacket tighter around himself, wishing he'd remembered his scarf. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated in the morning light as he took the long route, avoiding the park entirely. Westfield High loomed ahead, a sprawling brick building that had once been intimidating but now just felt like a prison with a 3-year sentence. Mason paused at the edge of the school grounds, watching other students stream through the main entrance, laughing and talking in comfortable groups. For a brief, intense moment, he considered turning around and just not going. Just walking away, anywhere else, any direction that wasn't here. But that wasn't really an option. His mother worked too hard, sacrificed too much for him to throw away his education, however miserable it made him. And graduation was only months away. He just had to survive until then. Taking a deep breath that made his ribs protest, Mason adjusted his backpack and walked toward the side entrance, the one fewer students used. He kept his head down, hood pulled up against the cold, focusing on becoming as unremarkable as possible. The day passed in a blur of classes and careful navigation of hallways. Mason had perfected the art of timing his movements to avoid crossing paths with Tyler and his friends, using longer routes between classes and finding secluded corners during breaks. By lunchtime, the constant vigilance had left him exhausted, a tension headache building behind his eyes. Instead of braving the cafeteria, Mason headed for the library, planning to claim one of the study carrels in the back and maybe even close his eyes for a few minutes. The library was usually a safe zone. Tyler and his crowd rarely ventured into that realm of voluntary learning. He was halfway down the main corridor when he heard his name called from behind. Wright. Hey, Mason Wright. Mason froze, his whole body tensing. But the voice wasn't Tyler's. It was younger, with a hint of accent that sounded vaguely familiar. Turning slowly, Mason found himself face to face with Diego Martinez. The younger boy stood in the middle of the hallway, seemingly oblivious to the flow of high school students moving around him. He wore a blue and white soccer jersey under an unzipped jacket, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Diego? Mason blinked in confusion. What are you doing here? Looking for you, Diego replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Your school secretary told me you'd probably be heading to the library. I've got a study hall period, and my teacher gave me a pass to come over. Mason glanced around nervously, acutely aware that they were standing in a busy hallway. Why were you looking for me? Diego's expression grew serious, his dark eyes studying Mason's face with that same direct gaze that had been so disconcerting in the park. "What happened to your eye?" Mason reflexively touched the fading bruise. "Nothing. Just an accident in gym class." "Uh-huh." Diego's tone made it clear he didn't believe that for a second. "Was it because of me?" "Because you helped me." The blunt question caught Mason off guard. Most people his age would have accepted the convenient lie, would have understood the social contract that dictated Mason's pride be preserved through mutual pretense. "No," Mason said automatically, then sighed at Diego's skeptical expression. "Maybe. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Diego said quietly. Something in the younger boy's voice, earnestness mixed with what sounded almost like guilt, made Mason relent slightly. "Look, it wasn't your fault," he said, lowering his voice as students passed by. "There was already history there. This would have happened eventually. Now, is there something specific you needed? Because lunch period's almost over." Diego hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, actually, I wanted to invite you to my soccer game this weekend. It's a big one, the showcase tournament. There'll be scouts there and everything." Of all the things Mason might have expected, this wasn't even on the list. "You want me to come to your soccer game? Why?" Diego shrugged, suddenly looking more like the 12-year-old he was. "I don't know. I thought maybe you'd want to. You helped me, and I'm playing really well lately," and he trailed off, seeming embarrassed. "It's okay if you don't want to. I just thought I'd ask." Mason stared at the younger boy, genuinely perplexed by the invitation. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had specifically sought out his presence, had wanted him to be somewhere just because. "I don't really know anything about soccer," he said finally. Diego's face brightened. "That's okay. It's not complicated. I can explain the rules if you want." The bell rang, signaling the end of the lunch period. Students around them began moving with renewed purpose toward their next classes. "I should go," Mason said, still bewildered by the entire interaction. "So will you come?" Diego persisted. "Saturday, 10 a.m. at the community fields. The big ones behind the recreation center." Mason hesitated. The idea of voluntarily putting himself in a public place, surrounded by strangers, went against every self-preservation instinct he'd developed over the past 3 years. And yet, the hopeful expression on Diego's face made it surprisingly difficult to refuse outright. "I'll try," he said finally, a non-commitment that left room for either outcome. It seemed to be enough for Diego, whose face split into a wide grin. "Great. I'll look for you. I'm number 14, in case you forget my face." "I doubt that," Mason said dryly, thinking that Diego's intense gaze was not easily forgotten. With a quick wave, Diego turned and jogged back toward the main entrance, presumably to return to the middle school building across the campus. Mason watched him go, still trying to process the unexpected encounter. As he continued to the library, Mason found his mood had shifted slightly. The weight of anxiety that had pressed on him all morning felt marginally lighter, replaced by a vague sense of bewilderment. Someone had sought him out, not to torment or mock, but to extend an invitation, to include. It was such a small thing, really. A child's soccer game. An hour or two on a Saturday morning that would likely be cold and uncomfortable on the metal bleachers. Yet as Mason settled into a quiet corner of the library, he realized he was actually considering going. Saturday dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that hinted at winter's approach without surrendering to it completely. Mason stood at his bedroom window, watching the morning light filter through nearly bare branches, casting intricate shadow patterns across the small backyard. He hadn't decided whether he was going to the soccer game until this very moment, had spent the past few days alternating between convincing himself it was a ridiculous idea and wondering if Diego would actually notice if he didn't show up. But something about the morning's quiet clarity, about the way the world seemed briefly paused in the early weekend stillness, nudged Mason toward a decision. He would go, just for a little while, just to see. His mother had already left for her shift at the hospital, leaving the house silent except for the occasional creaking of the old heating system. Mason dressed warmly, jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, his heaviest sweater, and the scarf he'd forgotten earlier in the week. His bruises had faded to the point where they were barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. The community fields were a 20-minute walk from his house, most of it along quiet residential streets. As Mason approached the recreation center, he could hear the sounds of the tournament already in progress. Whistles blowing, people cheering, the distinctive thud of feet connecting with balls. He hesitated at the edge of the parking lot, suddenly second-guessing his decision. What was he doing here? He didn't know Diego, not really. One brief interaction in the park, another awkward conversation in the school hallway. That wasn't a friendship, wasn't even an acquaintanceship. It was just a random connection, meaningless in the larger scheme of things. Mason was about to turn around when he caught sight of a familiar figure across the parking lot. Diego was warming up with his team on a practice area adjacent to the main fields, his dark curly hair unmistakable even at a distance. As Mason watched, the boy executed a complex series of moves with the ball, his face a study in concentration. Even to Mason's untrained eye, there was something impressive about the way Diego handled the ball, a fluid grace that made it look almost easy. His teammates seemed to defer to him slightly, watching his technique with expressions that bordered on respect. Before Mason could decide whether to approach or retreat, Diego looked up and spotted him. The boy's face transformed instantly, lighting up with a genuine smile that was visible even from across the distance. He waved enthusiastically, then held up a finger in a 1 minute gesture before jogging over to an adult Mason assumed was his coach. After a brief conversation, Diego sprinted across the parking lot toward Mason, practically vibrating with energy. "You came," he said, slightly out of breath. "I wasn't sure if you would." Mason shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I said I might." "Well, I'm glad you did. We're playing in 30 minutes on Field 3. It's the semifinals." Diego's excitement was palpable, his words coming fast. "If we win this one, we play the finals this afternoon. The regional academy scouts are here, just like Coach said they would be." "Academy scouts?" Mason asked, vaguely recalling Diego mentioning something about scouts in the school hallway. Diego nodded eagerly. "The Regional Development Academy. It's like the next level, you know, for serious players. They start training you properly, get you ready for higher competition. It could be a big deal." "Sounds important," Mason said, genuinely impressed by the younger boy's ambition. "You nervous?" "A little," Diego admitted, his excitement dimming slightly. "A lot, actually. But Coach says nervousness is just energy you haven't directed yet." "That's actually pretty good advice," Mason said, surprised. Diego grinned. "Coach is smart about that stuff. Anyway, I should get back to warm-up. But there are bleachers over there if you want to watch." He pointed to a set of metal stands along the sideline of Field 3. "My parents will be there too. They come to all my games." "Okay," Mason said, trying to sound casual about the prospect of sitting among strangers. "Good luck out there." "Thanks." Diego was already backing away, clearly eager to return to his team. "For coming, I mean. And for the other thing, too." In the park. Before Mason could respond, Diego had turned and was sprinting back to his team, leaving Mason standing alone at the edge of the parking lot. After a moment's hesitation, Mason made his way toward the bleachers Diego had indicated. They were beginning to fill with parents and supporters, but he found a spot at the end of the second row that offered a good view of the field while keeping some distance from the most enthusiastic spectators. As the teams took the field for warm-ups, Mason found himself scanning the sidelines, curious about Diego's parents. He spotted them easily enough. A petite woman with Diego's same dark, curly hair and expressive eyes standing beside a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face. They were watching their son with unmistakable pride as he ran through drills with his teammates. The game itself was more engaging than Mason had expected. Even with his limited knowledge of soccer, he could appreciate the skill and strategy involved. Diego played in what appeared to be a central position, seemingly involved in every significant movement of the ball. He was quick and creative, anticipating plays before they developed. By halftime, Diego's team was leading 2-1, with Diego having scored 1 goal and set up the other with what the enthusiastic parent next to Mason described as a beautiful through ball. During the break, Mason noticed a small group of adults on the sideline, clipboards in hand, watching the players with analytical expressions. The academy scouts, presumably. They seemed to be paying particular attention to Diego and a tall blonde player from the opposing team. The second half was more tense, the opposing team pressing hard for an equalizer. Mason found himself genuinely invested in the outcome, leaning forward on the cold metal bench, his breath catching when Diego made a particularly daring run or when the opposing team threatened to score. With 5 minutes remaining and the score still 2-1, Diego received the ball near midfield, spun away from a defender, and began a weaving run toward the goal. The crowd around Mason rose to their feet, anticipation building as Diego evaded another tackle, then another. He was in the penalty area now, one defender to beat. Mason was standing too, caught up in the collective excitement. Diego feinted left, then cut right, leaving the defender off balance. Only the goalkeeper remained between him and a goal that would surely secure the win. The shot was perfect, curving away from the diving keeper's outstretched hands, destined for the top corner of the net, until it wasn't. At the last possible moment, a defender Mason hadn't seen coming launched himself across the goal line, somehow getting his head to the ball and deflecting it over the crossbar. A collective groan went up from Diego's supporters. Mason sat back down, surprisingly disappointed on behalf of the younger boy. The game ended 2-1, a win for Diego's team, but not the emphatic victory that nearly brilliant goal would have provided. As the players shook hands and gathered around their respective coaches, Mason debated whether to leave or wait to congratulate Diego. The decision was made for him when Diego, after a brief team huddle, jogged directly toward the bleachers where Mason sat, waving for him to come down. "Did you see that?" Diego asked as Mason descended the metal steps. His face was flushed with exertion, sweat dampening his curls despite the cool air. "We're in the finals." "I saw him." Mason nodded, genuinely impressed. "You played really well. That last shot was amazing, even though it didn't go in." Diego beamed at the praise. "Thanks. I can't believe Jenkins got to it. That would have been the best goal I ever scored." "Maybe you'll score an even better one in the finals," Mason offered. "Maybe." Diego glanced over his shoulder to where his parents were waiting. "Hey, do you want to meet my mom and dad? They saw you help me that day." "I told them about you." Mason hesitated, suddenly uncomfortable. Meeting parents seemed like a level of social interaction he wasn't prepared for. "Actually, I should probably head home. I've got homework and stuff." Diego's face fell slightly, but he nodded. "Okay, the finals aren't until 3 anyway. But will you come back for that game? It's the big one." Mason wavered, caught between his instinct to retreat to the safety of solitude and the undeniable pull of Diego's earnest invitation. "I'll try," he said finally, the same non-commitment he'd offered before. This time, though, they both knew he probably would. The finals were more crowded than the earlier game, with what seemed like the entire community gathered to watch. Mason arrived just as the teams were taking the field, sliding into a spot at the very top of the bleachers, where he had a good view, but some distance from the most enthusiastic supporters. Diego spotted him almost immediately, flashing a quick smile and wave before returning his attention to his coach's final instructions. The opposing team looked formidable, taller and more physically developed than Diego's squad. Mason overheard someone nearby mention they were the defending tournament champions. From the opening whistle, it was clear this would be a more challenging match. The opposing team controlled possession early, pushing Diego and his teammates into the defensive positions. The first 20 minutes passed with several close calls but no goals, the tension building with each near miss. Then midway through the first half, disaster struck. Diego received a pass near the center circle and turned to begin an attack when an opposing player slid in hard from behind. The crack of the collision was audible even from the bleachers, followed by Diego's cry of pain as he tumbled to the ground, clutching his ankle. Mason found himself on his feet, hands gripping the metal railing in front of him as the referee blew his whistle and Diego's parents rushed onto the field. For several tense minutes, trainers examined Diego's ankle, while his teammates gathered in concerned huddles nearby. Finally, Diego limped off the field with assistance, his face contorted with pain and disappointment. His parents helped him to the bench, where the team's medical staff immediately began wrapping his ankle in ice. The game resumed without its most dynamic player, and the energy seemed to drain from Diego's team. By halftime, they were down 2-0, looking overwhelmed and disorganized without Diego directing the midfield. During the break, Mason watched as Diego engaged in an intense conversation with his coach, gesturing emphatically despite his obvious pain. After several minutes of discussion and a careful testing of the injured ankle, Diego began removing the ice wrap, a determined expression on his face. When the second half began, Diego was back on the field, moving with a noticeable limp but clearly intent on playing through the pain. His return seemed to energize his teammates, who suddenly found new reserves of effort. 10 minutes into the second half, Diego's team scored, cutting the deficit in half. The crowd erupted, sensing a potential comeback. Diego himself was playing differently now. Unable to rely on his usual speed and agility, he was compensating with precision passing and tactical awareness, orchestrating attacks from a more stationary position. With 15 minutes remaining, they equalized on a corner kick that Diego delivered perfectly to the head of a tall defender. The celebration was wild, parents and supporters jumping and shouting as the momentum of the game completely reversed. The final minutes were tense, both teams pushing for a winning goal, neither willing to settle for a tie that would lead to penalty kicks. Diego, despite his injury, remained at the center of every attack his team mounted, his determination visible in every labored movement. In the final minute of regulation time, Diego received the ball at the edge of the penalty area. A defender closed in quickly, but Diego, rather than attempting to beat him with skill he couldn't access due to his injury, simply shielded the ball with his body, drawing the foul. Free kick just outside the box. One last chance. The referee paced off the proper distance for the defensive wall as Diego placed the ball carefully on the ground. The crowd fell silent with anticipation. Mason found himself holding his breath. Diego took 3 steps back, his injured ankle clearly painful with each movement. He paused, focused intensely on the narrow target between the wall and the top corner of the goal, then ran forward with as much power as his injury would allow. The contact was perfect. The ball curled over the wall and dipped sharply, beyond the goalkeeper's desperate dive, into the top corner of the net. The explosion of sound was deafening. Diego's teammates swarmed him, nearly tackling him in their excitement. Parents and supporters were on their feet, shouting and cheering. The referee blew the final whistle moments after the restart, confirming Diego's team as tournament champions. Mason found himself cheering along with everyone else, caught up in the collective joy of the moment. He watched as Diego was lifted onto his teammates' shoulders, wincing in pain but beaming with triumph, the hero of the match despite, or perhaps because of, his injury. As the formal trophy presentation began, Mason decided it was time to leave. The celebration would continue for some time, and Diego would be at its center, surrounded by family, teammates, and coaches. There was no need for Mason to intrude on that moment. He was halfway across the parking lot when he heard his name called. Turning, he saw Diego limping toward him, still in his muddy uniform, the gold medal around his neck catching the late afternoon sunlight. "You're leaving?" Diego asked, breathing hard from the effort of catching up. "The team's going for pizza to celebrate. You should come." Mason shook his head, uncomfortable with the invitation to join a celebration where he would know no one except Diego. "No, that's okay. It's your team thing. You should enjoy it." Diego studied him for a moment, then nodded, seeming to understand Mason's reluctance. "Well, thanks for coming. Did you see the goal?" "I did," Mason smiled. "It was incredible, especially with your ankle like that." Diego grinned, pride evident in his expression. "Coach says playing through pain shows character, and the scouts were watching the whole time." One of them talked to Coach after the game, said they want me to come train with the academy in the spring. "That's great," Mason said, genuinely happy for the younger boy. "You deserve it. You were amazing out there." Diego's expression grew suddenly serious. "I wouldn't have been playing at all if it wasn't for you." Mason blinked, confused. "What do you mean? If you hadn't stopped those guys in the park that day, I might have been too scared to keep coming to practice. I might have quit." Diego spoke with the directness of someone much older. "My dad says sometimes one person makes all the difference, just by being brave when it matters." Mason felt his face warm with embarrassment. "I wasn't brave. I was terrified. But you still did it," Diego insisted. "That's what matters." Before Mason could respond, Diego's name was called from across the parking lot. His parents were waiting by their car, waving for him to join them. "I gotta go," Diego said. "But I'll see you around, right?" "Sure." Mason nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced their paths would cross again now that the tournament was over. Diego hesitated, then awkwardly extended his hand. Mason shook it, surprised by the formality of the gesture from someone so young. "Thanks again," Diego said, his dark eyes serious. "For everything." Then he was gone, limping back to his waiting parents, the gold medal bouncing against his chest as he moved. Mason watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. Not quite pride, not quite happiness, but something adjacent to both. He had done something that mattered to someone else. It was a novel sensation, one he wasn't entirely sure how to process. As he walked home through the gathering dusk, Mason found himself smiling faintly, replaying the image of Diego's perfect free kick and the joy that had followed. For once, his thoughts weren't dominated by fears of Monday's return to school or the careful navigation required to avoid Tyler and his friends. Instead, he was simply present in the moment, aware of the cold air on his face, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet, and the quiet satisfaction of having been part of something good. Pornum. The years that followed seemed to accelerate, time compressing in that strange way it does when life settles into patterns of work and routine. Mason graduated from Westfield High without fanfare, his final months there passing in relative peace. Not because Tyler and his crowd had reformed, but because they had found more interesting targets for their attention. College was a revelation. Mason attended the State University 2 hours from home, close enough to visit his mother regularly but far enough to start fresh. The anonymity of a large campus suited him, allowing him to define himself beyond the confines of his high school reputation. He discovered an aptitude for computer science, found a small group of like-minded friends, and gradually emerged from the protective shell he'd built around himself. He followed Diego Martinez's soccer career from a distance, occasionally seeing the boy's name mentioned in local newspaper articles about youth soccer achievements. The regional academy had indeed been a launching pad, leading to selection for elite youth tournaments and eventually a spot on the state's Olympic Development Program team. By the time Mason was in his senior year of college, Diego was a rising star in the high school soccer world, breaking records and attracting attention from college recruiters across the country. Sometimes Mason would think about attending one of his games, curious to see how the intense 12-year-old had developed, but something always held him back: coursework, internship applications, the general business of his own life moving forward. After graduation, Mason accepted a position with a software development company in the city, 30 miles from his hometown. He found an apartment, settled into the rhythms of professional life, and maintained the quiet, steady existence that suited his temperament. His mother finally retired from nursing, using her modest pension and savings to travel. Simple trips to visit relatives or see places she'd always wanted to explore. Mason encouraged her freedom, glad to see her finding joy after so many years of hard work and sacrifice. Time continued its relentless forward march. Seasons changed, technologies evolved, friends came and went. Mason built a life that was, if not extraordinary, then solid and satisfying in its stability. And then on a crisp autumn day that echoed the season of their first meeting 11 years earlier, Mason saw Diego Martinez again. It happened at a coffee shop near Mason's apartment, one of those gentrified establishments with exposed brick walls and carefully mismatched furniture. Mason was working remotely that day, laptop open on a small table near the window, half his attention on code and half on the golden leaves swirling past the glass. Mason Wright. The voice was deeper than he remembered, but carried the same directness, the same slight accent that had once been more pronounced. Mason looked up, momentarily disoriented by the sound of his name from an unexpected source. The young man standing before him was tall and athletic, with the same curly dark hair and intense eyes that Mason recalled, though now set in a face that had lost all traces of childhood. "Diego," Mason said, recognition dawning. "Diego Martinez?" Diego's face broke into a wide smile. "I can't believe it's you. I wasn't sure at first, but then I saw your profile when you turned, and I thought, it has to be him." Mason stood, suddenly aware of how strange this moment was. This collision of past and present in a random coffee shop on an ordinary Tuesday. "What are you doing here?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. "I mean, it's good to see you. You look grown up." Diego laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Last time you saw me, I was probably half this size. I'm actually in town for a game. My team's playing against City University tomorrow night." "Your team?" Mason echoed, trying to place the context. "Eastern State," Diego clarified. "I'm on soccer scholarship there." "Junior year. That's great," Mason said, genuinely pleased. "So all those academy dreams paid off?" Diego looked surprised. "You remembered that?" "Of course," Mason said. "The tournament, the scouts. It seemed important." A brief silence fell between them, the kind that acknowledges the strangeness of reconnecting across a significant gap of time. Around them, the coffee shop hummed with afternoon activity, baristas calling out orders, the hiss of the espresso machine, customers tapping on laptops or engaged in quiet conversations. "Are you working?" Diego asked, gesturing to Mason's laptop. "I don't want to interrupt." "No, it's fine," Mason said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I could use a break, actually. Do you want to sit?" Diego nodded, setting down his coffee cup and sliding into the chair across from Mason. He moved with the fluid grace of an athlete, economical and precise. "So you're in software?" he asked, glancing at Mason's screen where lines of code were visible. "Yeah, for about 5 years now. Nothing exciting, mostly back-end development for financial applications." Diego smiled. "Sounds more exciting than you're making it out to be." "Not compared to college soccer," Mason countered. "That's pretty impressive." Diego shrugged slightly. a gesture that seemed to acknowledge the achievement while deflecting the praise. It's been a good experience. Challenging, but good. We're ranked 12th nationally this season. Wow, Mason said, genuinely impressed. Professional aspirations? Maybe. Diego nodded. There's the MLS draft next year, but I'm keeping my options open. I'm studying business management too, so there's that path. Mason nodded, finding himself unexpectedly engaged in the conversation. There was something easy about talking with Diego, a natural flow that belied their limited history and the years between their last interaction. How's your mom? Diego asked. I remember you mentioned she was a nurse. The question caught Mason off guard. The fact that Diego remembered such a detail from their brief conversations years ago. She's good. Retired now. Finally taking time for herself after all those years of night shifts. That's great, Diego said warmly. She deserves it. Parents sacrifice a lot, you know. They do, Mason agreed, thinking of his mother's tired eyes and persistent encouragement throughout his childhood. How are your parents? Good. Dad's still in construction, but he's a foreman now. Mom's working as a patient care assistant at the hospital. Got her certification a few years ago. They come to all my home games, just like they did when I was 12. The mention of that specific age hung in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of when their paths had first crossed. Diego took a sip of his coffee, his expression growing more thoughtful. You know, I've thought about you over the years. Mason raised his eyebrows, surprised. Really? Why? That day in the park, Diego said simply. It stuck with me. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't a big deal. It was to me, Diego insisted, echoing words he'd spoken as a child. I actually looked for you a few times after that tournament season, but you'd graduated by then. You looked for me? Mason asked, genuinely puzzled by the idea. Diego nodded. I wanted to tell you that I made it into the academy program. I thought you'd want to know, since you came to the games and everything. A warm feeling spread through Mason's chest at the thought of young Diego seeking him out to share his success. I'm glad it worked out for you. I actually saw your name in the local paper a few times over the years. You were making quite a name for yourself in high school. Diego's eyes widened slightly. You followed my career. Not actively, Mason clarified, not wanting to seem strange. Just noticed when your name came up. It's not a common name. Diego smiled, seemingly pleased by the knowledge that he hadn't been entirely forgotten. Well, it's really good to see you. Strange coincidence running into each other like this. Very strange, Mason agreed. Do you live around here now? No, just in town for the game. The team's staying at a hotel near campus, but I needed better coffee than what they serve in the lobby. Diego glanced at his watch. Actually, I should probably head back soon. We have a team meeting at 4. Of course, Mason said, suddenly aware of how easily he'd fallen into conversation with someone who was essentially a stranger. Despite their brief connection years ago, Diego hesitated, then pulled out his phone. Would it be weird to exchange numbers? In case you want to come to the game tomorrow, I could leave your name at will call. Mason found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the offer. Sure, that would be great. They exchanged contact information, the modern ritual of sharing digital connections, briefly bridging the years of separation. As Diego stood to leave, he paused, his expression turning more serious. I meant what I said before, about thinking of you over the years. What you did that day, it mattered. Mason felt a flush of embarrassment at the earnest gratitude. I'm glad I could help. Diego seemed about to say something else, then simply extended his hand instead. Mason took it, noting the firm grip, so different from the awkward handshake of the 12-year-old boy after the tournament. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, Diego said. City University Stadium. I'm still number 14, in case you forget my face. The echo of his childhood words, offered now with a knowing smile that acknowledged the callback, made Mason laugh. I doubt that, he replied, completing the exchange across time. After Diego left, Mason remained at the table for a long while, his work forgotten as he processed the unexpected encounter. There was something profoundly strange about seeing the direct line from the intense child to the focused young man Diego had become, as if Mason had been granted a rare glimpse of cause and effect, of how small moments connected across years to shape a life. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Great running into you today. Hope you can make it tomorrow. Diego Martinez, of 14. Mason smiled at the screen, feeling an unexpected sense of continuity, as if a story he'd only glimpsed the beginning of might finally reveal its middle chapters. He typed a simple reply, I'll be there. The university stadium was larger than Mason had expected, with proper seating and floodlights illuminating the pitch in the early evening darkness. A decent crowd had gathered despite the weeknight scheduling, creating a buzz of anticipation as the teams warmed up on the field. Mason found his ticket waiting at will call as promised and made his way to a seat midway up the home team's section. He felt slightly out of place among the enthusiastic City University supporters, but no one seemed to notice or care about his neutral attire. The teams emerged from the tunnels for formal introductions. Eastern State in white and gold, City University in blue and black. Mason easily spotted Diego, still number 14, as the teams lined up at midfield. Even from a distance, Diego's posture conveyed confidence and focus, the bearing of someone comfortable in their element. As the national anthem played, Mason found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led him to this moment. 11 years ago, he'd stood up for a child he didn't know, an impulsive act that had briefly disrupted his carefully constructed invisibility. Now here he was, watching that same child, now a young man, prepare to showcase the talent that had been merely potential back then. The game began with high energy, both teams pressing forward in search of an early advantage. Diego played in a central midfield position, orchestrating Eastern State's attacks with precise passes and occasional driving runs that demonstrated both technical skill and tactical awareness. Midway through the first half, Diego received the ball near the center circle, turned smoothly past a defender, and delivered a perfectly weighted pass that split City's defense. His teammate raced onto it and scored with a clinical finish, putting Eastern State up 1-0. The visiting supporters erupted in cheers, while the home crowd groaned collectively. Mason found himself applauding the play, impressed by the vision and execution Diego had displayed. By halftime, the score remained 1-0, though both teams had created several chances. Mason purchased a coffee from a concession stand and returned to his seat, oddly invested in the outcome, despite having no particular allegiance to either university. The second half was more intense, with City University pushing hard for an equalizer. Their pressure paid off 15 minutes in, when a well-executed corner kick resulted in a headed goal that leveled the score at 1-1. The momentum seemed to shift toward the home team, their supporters growing louder with each attack. Eastern State found themselves defending more deeply, struggling to maintain possession against City's aggressive press. With 10 minutes remaining and the game hanging in the balance, Diego received a pass just inside City's half. Instead of playing it safe, he turned and accelerated directly toward the heart of the defense. One defender stepped forward to challenge. Diego nudged the ball past him with the outside of his foot, a subtle move executed at full speed. A second defender converged, but Diego was already cutting inside, creating just enough space to unleash a shot from 25 yards. The ball curled away from the goalkeeper's outstretched hand and nestled into the top corner of the net. A goal of stunning quality that silenced the home crowd momentarily before drawing reluctant applause from even the most partisan supporters. Mason found himself on his feet with the rest of the spectators, appreciating the pure skill of what he'd just witnessed. Diego's teammates swarmed him in celebration, while he pointed to the Eastern State coaches with a gesture that suggested the goal had been the execution of a planned strategy. The remaining minutes were tense, with City throwing everything forward in search of another equalizer. But Eastern State's defense held firm, and when the final whistle blew, they had secured a valuable 2-1 away victory. As the teams exchanged handshakes and congratulations, Mason debated whether to attempt to see Diego after the game. It seemed presumptuous to expect any time from him after such an important match. There would be team obligations, perhaps media interviews given the quality of his winning goal. Mason was just deciding to send a congratulatory text instead when his phone buzzed with a message. "Great game. If you're still here, I can meet you outside the south entrance in about 20 minutes after team talk." Surprised but pleased, Mason replied affirmatively and made his way toward the designated meeting point. The crowd was thinning as spectators headed to parking lots or nearby campus hangouts, the excitement of the match already fading into the rhythm of ordinary weeknight activities. Diego emerged from the players' entrance exactly when promised, hair damp from a shower, dressed in Eastern State warm-ups with a team bag slung over his shoulder. He spotted Mason immediately and approached with a wide smile. "You came," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I said I would," Mason replied. "Great game. That goal was incredible." Diego's smile widened at the praise. "Thanks. It felt good coming off my foot. Sometimes you just know it's going in, you know? I'll take your word for it." Mason laughed. My soccer experience is limited to watching you play, years ago and tonight. Well, I'm honored to be your entire soccer reference point, Diego said with a good-natured grin. The team's heading back to the hotel, but I have a couple hours before curfew. Want to grab something to eat? I'm starving after games. The invitation was casual but sincere, and Mason found himself nodding. Sure. There's a decent burger place about a block from here, if that works. Perfect, Diego said, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. Lead the way. The restaurant was moderately busy but not crowded, with a relaxed atmosphere that suited their impromptu meeting. They were seated in a corner booth, away from the noisier bar area, which Mason appreciated. Diego ordered a substantial meal, clearly replacing calories burned during the match, while Mason opted for something lighter. So, Diego said after their drinks arrived, "Tell me what you've been up to all these years." The complete Mason Wright story. Mason laughed softly at the grandiose framing. Not much to tell, honestly. College, job, apartment, pretty standard trajectory. I doubt that, Diego said, studying him with the same direct gaze he'd had as a child, though now it felt less disconcerting and more perceptive. Everyone has a story. Mine's just not particularly exciting, Mason insisted, slightly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. What about you? Professional soccer seems a lot more interesting than software development. Diego accepted the deflection gracefully. It's been a journey. The academy was intense, training 5 days a week while still handling school, then high school varsity, then the college recruitment process. It's competitive, you know. Thousands of kids with the same dream, all fighting for limited spots. But you made it, Mason observed. So far, Diego nodded. There's still the pro level to consider. That's another huge jump in both quality and competition. Do you think you'll make it? Mason asked, genuinely curious. Diego considered the question with surprising seriousness. I think I have a shot. My coach says I have the technical ability and game intelligence. It's just a matter of whether the right opportunity comes along at the right time. He paused, taking a sip of his water. But I'm realistic too. That's why I'm serious about my business degree. Soccer careers are short, even when they go well. Mason was impressed by the maturity of the perspective. You've thought this through. I've had good advice, Diego said. My parents, coaches, mentors, people who've helped me see the bigger picture. He hesitated, then added, like you did that day. Mason felt the familiar discomfort rise at the mention of their first meeting. I really didn't do anything special. You keep saying that, Diego observed. But here's the thing. You didn't have to do anything at all. You could have walked by. Most people would have. Their food arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. Mason was grateful for the interruption, using the moment to gather his thoughts. He'd never been comfortable with praise, especially for something he still viewed as a minor incident, blown out of proportion by a child's perspective. As they began eating, Diego seemed to sense Mason's discomfort and changed the subject. So what do you do outside of work? Any hobbies, interests? The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, their conversation flowing easily between topics. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, the changes in their hometown over the years. Diego was an engaging conversationalist, attentive and quick-witted, with none of the self-absorption Mason might have expected from a successful collegiate athlete. As they finished their meals, Diego checked the time. I should probably head back soon. Team breakfast is early tomorrow before we travel. Of course, Mason nodded, signaling for the check. This was nice, though. Unexpected, but nice. Very unexpected, Diego agreed with a smile. But maybe not entirely coincidental. What do you mean? Diego shrugged slightly. I don't know. It just seems significant, running into you now. Full circle in a way. The check arrived, and both reached for it simultaneously. My treat, Mason said. Consider it a congratulations on the win. Only if you let me get it next time, Diego countered, then looked slightly embarrassed. I mean, if there is a next time, I don't want to presume. I'd like that, Mason said, surprising himself with how genuinely he meant it. When are you back in town? We play City again in February for the return fixture, Diego said. And I'm around during winter break in December. Well, my coffee shop knowledge is at your disposal whenever you're here, Mason offered with a smile. Outside the restaurant, the night had grown cooler, the autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter not far behind. They stood somewhat awkwardly on the sidewalk, that strange moment of parting between people who are neither strangers nor quite friends. I should call a car to get back to the hotel, Diego said, pulling out his phone. I can drive you, Mason offered impulsively. My apartment's not far from here. We could get my car and I'll drop you off. Diego looked up from his phone, a smile spreading across his face. That would be great, actually. Thanks. The walk to Mason's apartment was brief, their conversation continuing easily. Mason found himself relaxing into the interaction, the initial strangeness of reconnecting with someone from his past giving way to the simple pleasure of good company. As they approached his building, Diego suddenly stopped, his attention caught by something across the street. Is that a bookstore? It looks like it's still open. Mason glanced over at the small independent shop, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Yeah, Benchmark Books. They're open late on weeknights. They have a reading nook in the back with coffee and tea. It's a nice spot. Do you mind if we stop in for a minute? Diego asked. I'm always looking for good books for road trips. Sure. Mason nodded, slightly surprised by the request. The bookstore was quiet, only a few customers browsing the shelves. Mason followed as Diego wandered through the sections, occasionally pulling out volumes that caught his interest. Reading back covers and first pages. You're really into books, Mason observed after watching Diego carefully examine several titles. Diego nodded, shelving a novel he'd been considering. My mom used to take me to the public library every Saturday when I was a kid. It was our thing. Even when soccer started taking up more time, we kept that tradition as long as we could. There was something touching about the image. The serious young boy Mason had met, spending weekend mornings in the library with his mother despite the pull of athletic ambitions. Diego eventually selected 2 books, a novel Mason had read and enjoyed, and a biography of a Brazilian soccer player. As they approached the register, Diego paused by a display of local authors. Hey, did you know about this? He asked, picking up a book with a familiar name on the cover. Mason felt a flush of embarrassment as Diego examined the slim volume titled Code Patterns, Essays on Technology, Structure, and Meaning by Mason Wright. Yeah, that's mine, Mason admitted. Just a collection of essays I wrote for a tech journal. The publisher approached me about compiling them. Diego looked up, genuine surprise on his face. You're published? That's incredible. It's not a big deal, Mason said, uncomfortable with the attention. Just technical writing for a niche audience. Diego was already flipping through the book, scanning the table of contents. This is really cool, Mason. 901, The Poetry of Programming. Structural echoes between code and narrative. These sound fascinating. They're probably boring unless you're into software development, Mason said, though secretly pleased by Diego's interest. I'm buying it, Diego decided, adding the book to his selections. You don't have to do that, Mason protested. I can give you a copy. I want to, Diego insisted. Besides, maybe you could sign it for me? The request was so unexpected that Mason didn't know how to respond. He'd never signed a copy of his book before, had never even considered the possibility that someone might ask. After Diego completed his purchase, they found a quiet corner of the store where Mason somewhat awkwardly signed the book, feeling self-conscious about the entire process. To Diego, he wrote, from park encounters to unexpected reunions, life takes interesting turns. Best wishes, Mason Wright. Diego read the inscription and smiled. Perfect. Thanks. As they left the bookstore and walked the remaining distance to Mason's apartment building, Diego carefully placed his purchases in his team bag. I'll start yours on the bus ride home tomorrow. Let me know what you think, Mason said, surprised to find he was genuinely curious about Diego's opinion of his writing. The drive to Diego's hotel was comfortable, their conversation continuing easily until Mason pulled up to the entrance. Thanks for coming to the game, Diego said as he gathered his bag. And for dinner, and the ride. It was my pleasure, Mason replied, finding he truly meant it. Good luck with the rest of your season. Diego hesitated, hand on the door handle. I'm glad we ran into each other, Mason. Really glad. Me too, Mason said, realizing with some surprise that it was true. After Diego disappeared into the hotel, Mason sat in his car for a moment before pulling away from the curb. There was something quietly significant about the evening, about reconnecting across time with someone whose life had briefly intersected with his own, then diverged, only to converge again unexpectedly. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Mason found himself thinking about the strange ripples of influence that move through lives, how a single moment of courage or kindness might travel outward in ways impossible to predict or measure. He had helped a child once, in a brief encounter he'd nearly forgotten, and somehow, years later, that same child, now a young man, had reappeared, carrying the memory of that moment with a significance Mason had never assigned to it. There was something profoundly humbling in that realization, that the smallest actions might matter more than we can know, might be carried forward by others long after we've forgotten them ourselves. When Mason arrived home, he had a text message waiting. "Thanks again for everything. I meant what I said earlier. Running into you feels significant somehow. Let's not lose touch this time. Craigadinum, Derinos, Diego." Mason smiled at the screen, feeling a warm certainty that they wouldn't. The relationship that developed between Mason and Diego over the subsequent months was unexpected but genuine. A friendship that bridged their age difference and distinct life paths with surprising ease. They texted regularly, conversations ranging from book recommendations to career developments to the occasional philosophical debate. When Diego returned to the city for winter break in December, they met several times. For coffee, for meals, for a local jazz concert Mason had tickets to. There was an easy comfort between them, the initial strangeness of their reconnection giving way to the simple pleasure of compatible company. Mason attended Diego's return match against City University in February, watching with pride as the younger man orchestrated another victory for his team, this time assisting on both goals in a 2-0 win. Afterward, they celebrated with dinner at the same burger place, now established as their spot, by mutual unspoken agreement. As Diego's senior year approached, their conversations increasingly turned to his future. The professional soccer possibilities, the business career alternatives, the complex decisions that awaited him. Mason listened more than advised, offering perspective when asked, but mostly providing the space for Diego to articulate and explore his options. The MLS draft is in January, Diego explained during one of their coffee shop meetings in late summer. But there's also interest from a couple of teams in Europe. Lower division, but still professional. And then there's the job offers from the internship I did last summer. Quite the set of options, Mason observed, impressed but not surprised. Diego approached his future with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. Too many options sometimes feels worse than too few, Diego admitted with a rueful smile. Every path means closing doors on others. True, Mason nodded. But that's life, isn't it? A series of choices that narrow some possibilities while opening others. Diego considered this, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I guess I'm just afraid of making the wrong choice." "There probably isn't a single right choice," Mason suggested. "Just different paths with different challenges and rewards." "That's actually helpful," Diego said, looking slightly surprised. "I've been thinking about it as right versus wrong, but maybe it's just different versus different." Mason smiled, pleased to have offered some useful perspective. "Exactly. And you'll make the most of whichever path you choose, because that's who you are." Diego looked up, meeting Mason's eyes with a directness that echoed the serious 12-year-old he'd once been. "How did you get so wise?" "Trial and error," Mason laughed. "Mostly error." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Mason found himself reflecting on how their roles had evolved, how he'd moved from briefly being Diego's protector to becoming something of a mentor and friend. It was a relationship neither could have anticipated in that park 11 years ago. Yet it felt natural, as if their lives had been destined to reconnect in this way. As autumn returned, marking a full year since their chance meeting in the coffee shop, Mason received an unexpected invitation. Diego wanted him to attend senior night, when the graduating players on Eastern State's soccer team would be honored before their final home game. Each senior gets to invite family to walk onto the field with them for the ceremony. Diego explained over the phone. "My parents are coming, of course, but I'm allowed to have one more person, and I'd like it to be you." Mason was momentarily speechless, genuinely touched by the request. "Me? Are you sure? Don't you have, I don't know, a girlfriend or someone else you'd rather include?" Diego laughed softly. "No girlfriend at the moment. And yes, I'm sure. You've been important in my journey, Mason. More than you realize." "I'd be honored," Mason said finally, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "Just tell me when and where." The night of the ceremony was clear and cool. The Eastern State campus vibrant with autumn colors and pre-game excitement. Mason met Diego's parents outside the stadium, Elena and Roberto Martinez, who greeted him with warm handshakes that turned into hugs when Diego explained who Mason was. "So you're the one," Elena said, her eyes bright with recognition. "The boy who helped Diego in the park. He's told us about you many times over the years." "All good things, I hope," Mason said, slightly embarrassed by the attention. "The best things," Roberto assured him, his hand firm on Mason's shoulder. "Some people pass through our lives quickly but leave permanent marks. You were such a person for our son." The ceremony itself was moving. Seniors in their uniforms walking onto the field accompanied by their loved ones. Brief biographies read over the public address system highlighting their achievements and future plans. When Diego's name was called, Mason walked alongside Elena and Roberto, feeling strangely emotional as the announcer described Diego's accomplishments. Team captain, 3-time all-conference selection, academic honor roll, drafted in the first round by an MLS team for the coming season. Diego stood tall between his parents, one arm around his mother's shoulders, the other hand gripping his father's in a gesture of deep connection. Mason stood slightly apart, content to witness this family moment, until Diego reached out and pulled him into the circle, including him in the embrace as the crowd applauded. After the ceremony, as they watched the game from special seats reserved for the honorees' families, Elena leaned over to speak quietly to Mason. "He looked for you, you know," she said. "After that tournament when he was 12, he wanted to tell you about making the academy team. He mentioned that once." Mason nodded. "I'd already graduated by then." Elena smiled, her eyes following her son on the field as he orchestrated Eastern State's midfield with confident precision. "He never forgot what you did. In fact, he started a program at his high school. Older students mentoring younger ones who were being bullied. He called it Standing Up. Did he tell you about that?" Mason shook his head, surprised. "No, he never mentioned it. It helped many children," Elena continued. "All because of what you did that day. One small action, many ripples." The game ended in a convincing win for Eastern State, a fitting conclusion to the seniors' home careers. Afterward, amid the celebrations and photographs, Diego found a moment to speak privately with Mason. "Thank you for coming," he said, still in his uniform, the sweat of his efforts visible on his face despite the cool evening air. "It meant a lot to have you here." "Thank you for including me," Mason replied sincerely. "Your mom told me about the mentoring program you started in high school." Diego looked momentarily embarrassed. "She did? I was going to tell you about that someday." "Why didn't you?" Mason asked, genuinely curious. Diego shrugged slightly, a gesture that reminded Mason of the 12-year-old boy despite the man he'd become. "I guess I wanted you to know me as I am now, not just as the kid you helped once." At least at first, Mason nodded, understanding the desire to be defined by one's present rather than past. "It's impressive what you've accomplished. Not just soccer, but everything else too." Diego's expression grew serious. "I've been thinking a lot about influence lately, how people shape each other's lives, sometimes without realizing it. What you did that day, it wasn't just about stopping those guys. It was about showing me what courage looks like." Mason started to demur, uncomfortable as always with Diego's earnest gratitude. But Diego continued before he could speak. "Not fearlessness," he clarified, "but doing something difficult despite being afraid. I saw that in you and it stayed with me. Every time I faced a challenge, soccer tryouts, standing up to peer pressure, pursuing opportunities that scared me, I remembered how you looked that day. Terrified but determined." Mason swallowed against a sudden tightness in his throat. "I didn't think anyone noticed that I was scared. I noticed everything about that moment," Diego said simply. "It changed me." They stood in silence for a beat, the weight of Diego's words settling between them. Around them, the celebrations continued. Players taking photos with family members, coaches offering congratulations, the general bustle of post-game activities. "So professional soccer next," Mason said finally, shifting the conversation to safer ground. "Are you ready?" Diego's face brightened. "As ready as I can be. Preseason training starts in January. It's going to be a whole new level of challenge." You'll handle it," Mason said with certainty. "You've never backed down from a challenge as long as I've known you." Diego laughed. "Well, our acquaintance has been somewhat intermittent." "True," Mason acknowledged with a smile. "But I think I've seen enough to know." They were interrupted by teammates calling Diego for a group photo, the moment of private connection giving way to the public celebrations. As Diego jogged away, he called back over his shoulder. "This isn't the end of our story, you know. Just another chapter." Mason waved acknowledgement, watching as Diego joined his teammates, fitting seamlessly into the group while somehow maintaining the distinct presence that had been evident even as a child. Later that night, as Mason drove home under a canopy of stars, he reflected on the strange, beautiful symmetry of their connection. How a single moment of courage had rippled outward through time, touching lives he'd never known about, eventually circling back to enrich his own life in unexpected ways. The bullied teen who had stood up for a kid could never have imagined that the gesture would echo across years, that the child would grow not just into a successful athlete, but into a young man of character who carried that moment forward, amplifying its impact through his own actions. It was, Mason thought, a powerful reminder that no act of kindness is ever wasted, that courage, even the imperfect, trembling kind, matters more than we can know in the moment. As the city lights appeared on the horizon, Mason felt a profound sense of peace. Their story wasn't over, as Diego had said. It was still unfolding, still revealing new dimensions of connection and meaning. And for the first time in many years, Mason found himself genuinely excited to discover what the next chapters might bring.